So I'm sitting here with a slightly furrowed brow as you're describing that because I want to agree with what you're saying, and I don't think I do completely, honestly.
Well, then we have a problem. Dude.
Well, I know. So, I'm thinking out loud here as I say this. So, welcome to Hallway Conversations. We're a trio of educators who have plenty of questions about teaching and learning and school culture, and we believe in the value of collaboration and reflection as we seek to keep growing as teachers. So this podcast is our place for thinking out loud together about issues in education and why they might matter to Christian educators. Welcome to the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hallway Conversations. My name's Matt Beamers.
I'm Abby DeGroat.
And I'm Dave Mulder.
Friends, just over a year ago, Dave and I found ourselves in a hallway conversation that probably started with me asking where I could find some sticky notes because I was the new guy in town and was very needy.
That's true.
I still am very needy. And we probably ended up talking about whether the whiteboard and marker is a form of technology, of which Dave has opinions, I've discovered.
Yeah.
At some point, we joked during that conversation about starting a podcast. And so we did. And soon after, Abby joined us and elevated the whole production.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure a year ago I thought we would still be going, if I'm going to be honest. Here we are now, 1 year later, 50 episodes in and almost 13,000 downloads. So I just want to start by saying on behalf of Abby and Dave, thanks for joining us over the past year. And whether this is your first time or you've been with us from the beginning, we are deeply grateful that you partner with us. Please consider sharing the link to these podcasts with some friends. We continue to try to reach new people in new places. And if you have any feedback or questions, topics for discussion, please email us at hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. That's hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. Dave and Abby, we've been using check-in questions the last few weeks, and some of them fun, some of them off the wall, all of them enjoyable. Trying to model that practice for teachers. But I guess my check-in question is related to just kind of, we've been doing this for a year now, and so I'm just wondering for you, because we haven't really talked much about this, to be honest, like, how do you look back at this whole experience of we call it podding.
Right.
How do you feel about this, a year into this? Like, I don't know, what stands out for you, or what do you notice? What do you wonder?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I think for me, these are the kinds of conversations I would have wanted to listen in on when I was teaching in K-12.
Yeah.
And I just feel so grateful that we get to do this. I know that's
Right.
my line, right?
Yeah.
But we get to do this. We get to have these kinds of conversations. And then to hear back from folks who are listening in and like saying, hey, what you said there made a difference. And now I'm thinking about this. And I've had a few of those, right?
Yeah.
Somebody sends you an email or text you and it's like, wow, thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Thank you, listeners.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Thank
listening.
you.
Absolutely.
How about you, Abby?
Yeah, I think these are the kind of conversations I naturally have anyway,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Or seek out, or
Yeah,
I had one with our colleague this morning, right?
Yeah.
And so and I also love podcasts, so it's really cool.
Yeah.
I love to learn from other people doing this exact
Yeah.
same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? And so for me, it's I never thought of myself as someone who would put my voice out publicly, maybe in this context, but it's actually been very much a good fit. And so same, it's been really fun to connect with people that I otherwise would not have connected with, and just it's been a great reflection tool for me as well, professional development.
I would really agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
To me, this is like the best personal professional development I've had in several years.
Kind of like our own PLC, right? It's our own personal learning community.
Yeah.
Where we can push each other's thinking.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the same thing. If I think about, man, how much have these conversations contributed to my growth, especially as someone who is newer to higher education, even. Sure. I think just building relationship with you has been, with both of you, it's strange to me that 18, 20 months ago, I literally did not know you.
Right.
Now I can, you were two of my dear friends here, and you sustained me and kept me going in many different ways, and I'm super thankful for that. When you're new in a place, you wonder how that will happen, and you trust God will provide you with people to keep you going, but you don't know who that's going to be when you arrive. So I would say just selfishly thankful for the relationship building, thankful for my own professional growth. I would also say, we've all experienced this where we get an email or a note or a message from someone somewhere, and we pass it on. And I think I passed one on that I received from someone in British Columbia the other day, someone who's doing preparing to be a teacher, and listens to the podcast as they go on to their classes, to their university classes, and I'm just basically saying, hey, thanks for bringing your faith into this discussion, because it's not part of the program that I'm involved in right now, and it's sort of for them, it's a time of renewal, and say, hey, this matters, and so just really thankful. But still surprised that we're still sitting here, guys. I'm honest. I mean, I remember, Dave, we joked, let's try 10.
Right? That was our initial run.
And I still think we just keep saying, should we try 10 more? And we'll keep
We
going.
might run out of stuff to talk about.
Who knows?
Yeah, totally. I run out of stuff to talk about frequently. So, anyways, Dave and Abby, I want to bring a quote. I know all of us really enjoy Parker Palmer. So I'm going to share a quote, and then I'm going to give you the context, because the context is going to explain why I'm wrestling a bit with Palmer, even though I want to be clear, I really love Palmer, and he has been Parker Palmer and The Courage to Teach, and several of his other books have been really helpful in my own faith and personal and professional journey. But so here's the quote, and it's quite lengthy, but So here we go. After 3 decades of trying to learn my craft, every class comes down to this. My students and I, face to face, engaged in an ancient and exacting exchange called education. The techniques I have mastered do not disappear, but neither do they suffice. Face to face with my students, only one resource is at my immediate command. My identity, my selfhood, my sense of this I who teaches, without which I have no sense of the thou who learns. Here is a secret hidden in plain sight. Good teaching cannot be reduced to technique. Good teaching comes from the identity and integrity of the teacher. In every class I teach, my ability to connect with my students and to connect them with the subject depends less on the methods I use than on the degree to which I know and trust my selfhood, and am willing to make it available and vulnerable in the service of learning. He then goes on to say, if good teaching cannot be reduced to technique, I no longer need to suffer the pain of having my peculiar gift as a teacher crammed in the Procrustean bed of someone else's method and the standards prescribed by it. The pain is left throughout education today as we insist upon the method du jour, leaving people who teach differently feeling devalued, forcing them to measure up to norms not their own. So here's the context, and I've really been wrestling with this. So the reason I share this quote, listeners, is because I found myself in a conversation some time ago with a friend whom I have great respect, which is why I'm sharing this in the spirit of respect, because it was actually a wonderful conversation. And at some point, my friend seemed to suggest that some of what we might consider good practices in education, and let's just use, for example, the use of learning targets, objectives, was taking some of the joy out of the teaching, of their teaching and the student learning. That the feeling that everything was almost becoming prescriptive.
Yeah.
So my question is, are we on the edge, or have we turned teaching and learning too much into a science, into a prescription, into a technique? And are we losing the art of it to the detriment of teachers and students? Dave, you often talk about Palmer's quote, we teach who we are.
Yeah.
And my question is, if education becomes too prescribed, can we actually teach who we are, or are we teaching who people want us to be? So that has been my wrestling, kind of the art and the science, but really around these things that we put high value on, specific lesson plans, learning targets, outcomes, that there's hardly any room for teachers to be who they are. And I'm not saying that's my one. I've wrestled with that, and so I'm going to leave it at that, and just a notice and wonder for you, and I'm wondering what you're thinking. Abby, can I put you on the spot?
Yeah, and in my view, like, even if we have a learning target, even if we have a common assessment, there's still a lot of ways to get us there.
Yeah.
into which I can infuse myself and my art.
Yeah.
Right? So I think teaching is an art and a science. I believe that.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it should be one or the other.
Yeah.
Right? I think at its fullest, I think it's both. Because I think we need to know where we're going. So I think we need those targets. I think we need some of those standards, or we have that danger of kind of wandering off the path. What are we doing? Right? Like, what's the purpose of this? Where are we going? I think students need that, right? So I taught adolescents, and I've seen it over and over again in classrooms where they don't know what the purpose of something is. They are more likely to disengage as students. Right? So I think we need that common target. But I've seen the same standards taught in wildly different ways in different, so my subject is English, right? In different English classrooms. People get there in wildly different ways.
Yeah. Is there not so if I can push back, is there not a danger though, like of when you have a learning target or you have these clear objectives all the time, is that it sort of determines always where the road, I don't want to say end because the learning continues, but sort of like it lays out this map. And there's different ways to get there, but you always kind of know where the map sort of ends, for lack of a better word. You know where the destination is. And my wonder about it, and now I'm saying this, and you are an English teacher, I was an English teacher. My wonder about it sometimes, though, is, but what if we didn't? Is there not space for it to end somewhere? Like, why do we always have to set the target and say this is where it's got to go, whereas and you cut yourself off from these organic moments that rise up, and you're like, oh, this changes it in something, like a comment from a student, a question. And sometimes I wonder if by having so many outcomes or targets, if we lose the joy of the journey in some ways. And not that it's joyless, but to say, like, like one year I can teach a Flannery O'Connor story, and without that specific lockdown target, I might end up in place A. And then because of the class and what they need and the discussion, what's going on in the world, it's like, oh, we went a way different way the next year. And so I sometimes wonder if the science of those things, if those wonderful spontaneous learning opportunities become somewhat muted. That's my one. Right. That's my wonder. Right. But Dave, what do you?
I'm sitting here with a slightly furrowed brow as you're describing that, because I want to agree with what you're saying, and I don't think I do completely, honestly.
Well, then we have a problem. Dave.
I'm thinking out loud here as I say this. So I want to give an analogy that I've used with students before when we talk about curriculum. For a second. So, like, if you imagine yourself standing on the edge of a field, like literally standing on the edge of a field, and you have to get to the other side of the field. Like, so let's just say that's the goal. There are so many different paths you could take to get across that field. Right? Okay. So now here's the analogy piece. The field represents a content area. So we sometimes talk about, like, the field of studying English or the field of mathematics or the field of whatever. And the curriculum is the path you plot through that field. And so in the field of, I'm going to pick on math for a minute here because it's an easier one for me to get my hands around. So in the field of mathematics, there is a path through that field that we call Algebra 1. And there are certain way markers on that path that it's on this particular path. Does that mean you're never going to talk about geometry or trigonometry? No, because those are also in this field, and sometimes they're right next to the path in algebra. Sometimes they're not. Okay, so there's kind of that way we can think about Flannery. So I guess I'm thinking about this, carrying this forward, thinking in English, and you're going to read the Flannery O'Connor story. So maybe, like, in this field of English, you have a course called literature, and that's the path you're following. And some years it's going to be a more winding path than others, but I still think there is a place you're going either way, right?
Well, and for me, like, why isn't one of the goals to read and interpret complex literature, right? That could go a million ways, but that's still a learning target. Right? We still are very clear about what we're doing here. And Flannery has like umpteen themes, right? Where directions that you could go, the language you could study, the things that students will pick up on and notice and relate to their own lives. But that broader target still gives room for that differentiation.
And maybe that's the issue, that like if you read like the Common Core standards for math and for English language arts, well, yeah, like if you get way in the weeds on those standards documents, they're very detailed, and like I'm not opposed to standards.
Some are not.
Well, that's fair. That's fair.
Like read and understand literature at a 12th grade level. And
that's a very broad scale target, right?
Yeah.
And then sometimes they're so specific that it's like, I don't disagree that second graders should learn how to subtract, whole numbers. Okay, they should, right? Yeah. But there's different kinds of learning outcomes, I think, that we could name them too, and maybe that's the path forward on this, right? Like if we're getting so caught up on all these little tiny detailed things. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't ever focus on the details, but that changes the kind of learning that we're talking about then too, maybe.
Yeah, but my wonder is, okay, so we've done a podcast on protocols, and we talked about protocols last week, and I love protocols. So again, this is this is me again thinking out loud. Is my love of using protocols then bordering on here's the science of it, versus I'm not being who I am anymore. It is getting very like, do this, do the, am I less being myself? And then maybe that's not a bad thing. It's just, again, it's my wonder where we start, are we relying on so many of these things that we're, like he talks about, right? He says it cannot be reduced to technique. It comes from the identity and the integrity of the teacher. And then I sometimes, as I read that, like I confess to you, my first thought when I read that was, is my use of protocols and my love of protocols reducing teaching to a technique? And that was my wonder. And I have to answer that myself, but it's just a wonder. Are we in danger then of it becoming? Is there a risk of it becoming too sciencey, where we're just like, hey, do this, do that, and I just changed something in one of my classes to use a protocol.
Sure.
Right? and again, I feel like it will work, but it's also.
But it's still just a tool in the hands of you who are the teacher.
Yeah.
Right? You can use protocols very differently.
Totally.
The same protocol, right?
And it can play out in very different ways.
Right. And you're still designing when to use it and what material to use it with. I still see the fingerprints of the teacher all over that.
Yeah.
And maybe this is one of those places, I'll pick on you for a second here since you brought this up, right? Like you gravitate towards protocols because that's part of your craft of how you're going to do your work as a teacher. And
because you value equal voices, right? And you value student participation. That's who you are.
I just wonder, like I feel like I've had more conversations with teachers just about some of the bureaucracy of teaching of the pit. And so maybe that's something different.
Yeah, and there definitely is, right? So our student teachers, for example, are running more and more into, especially at the elementary level, scripted curriculum.
Yeah.
And that, in my view, is very different from what we're talking about of learning targets where the teacher gets to decide how we meet them. That is a book, and you read from the book. That is soul killing. In some ways. Right? And I'm not saying that it never has its place, but that's not the same. Right? That's hard to teach who you are.
So as I read Palmer, right, just this line of good teaching not being reduced to technique, because it leaves people who teach differently feeling devalued. And so that's what I'm wondering is, even as teacher prep, are we teaching teachers to teach a very specific way that might leave some feeling devalued? And I am confident we're not devaluing them. It's just that's really strong language to me, actually, right? And what I felt like when I was having this conversation with like I said, a respected friend, was a sense of sort of being devalued. I have to do these things that are now being asked of me, and it's making me feel like I'm less of who I am and feeling devalued in that. And I'm empathetic to that.
Sure.
I guess. And that doesn't mean to throw out targets, and it doesn't mean to throw out, protocols. But to be aware of that, I guess.
This section that you read, and I've read the book many times, so I remember this bit of it. He talks about good teaching comes from the identity and integrity of the teacher. I think that was a bit right at the beginning, right? And that really resonates with me. Because I think that there is this kind of lifeless way of marching through this scripted curriculum that you can, and I would agree, like that's not what I want to be about. Right? So how do I find that like identity? So who am I? And integrity, I take that more not in the like do the right thing for the right reasons, but more like being whole, right? Integral, that it's wholeness. So who are you and how does it all hang together? And so when you step out on stage, so to speak, as a teacher, that you're bringing your whole self into that work. And I don't think that having a learning target, even a mandated learning target, that somebody else says you have to teach this, negates that, right? And I guess I'm coming back to my friend John Van Dyke, his lovely book, The Craft of Christian Teaching. I love that imagery of a craft, right? Like, because what does it mean to be a craft? That it has both. There are universals. It is a science, but it's also an art, right? Like both of those things can be true at the same time, as Abby said.
I was visiting a student teacher today, actually, in English classroom, and she was teaching her students about writing introductions, and she actually put the Iowa Standard on the board, and she led them through a couple of exercises where they read introductions from mentor texts, and she had them underlining on those introductions places where the author introduced the narrator, places where they presented a situation or a problem or I forget what the third one was. And she had them underline those. And we had a conversation afterwards, and she said, like, these ninth graders don't know where to start when they write an introduction. And so this frame, there's still all kinds of choices inside of that, but it gives them something to start with, right? That they can then shape how they want to. And I wonder sometimes if standards or targets function that way as kind of
for us as teachers,
like as a loose framework that inside of which then we have the freedom to craft. At least it gives us a starting place, right?
Otherwise, freedom within the law, so to speak, right? Like don't see them as something that inhibits, but actually just as a jumping off point to all kinds of
at least I know what I'm doing.
Of possibilities.
Right.
Folks, I'm going to add one more wrinkle to this now because we've done check-in questions. Another protocol that we use sometimes is exit tickets. So I'm going to give an exit ticket today. Today's exit ticket is you have to choose a circle, square, or triangle, right? So circle, something that's still circling around in your head. Something that's a square, something that's square. We've talked about that squares with your thinking, or a triangle, like you're making a connection to something else. So that's today's exit ticket. A circle, circling around, something that squares. We talked about that squares with your thinking, or you're making a connection. So
I think I've got a circle, and I'm still just circling on the big question that you were asking from the very beginning of this. Like, can good teaching be reduced to technique? And I think the answer is no. I think it's more than that. But I'm still circling because I think technique really does matter. And I think I want to keep puzzling on that one for a little while.
All right. Abby, circle, square, triangle. Passing's normative with always.
Unrelated to this podcast or education, I'm reading a couple of places. I've come across this idea in my reading lately in my personal devotional reading about Christianity being more than just a personal belief system or morality, but actually walking in the ways of Jesus, right? And these spiritual disciplines, and that is a huge part of my faith. And so I'm just circling around that idea and what that means for my own life right now.
I think I'm still circling around this idea as well of the science of teaching doesn't negate the art of it. It's not an either or, but also how do I, even in my own pedagogy, make sure I keep that balance, that it's not all art,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also not all science, and that these work together actually. And I think what you said, Abby, earlier about like there's actually, when you actually have clear boundaries, there's actually more freedom when there's no boundaries at all. And so I think that was really helpful language for me. Friends, we know that your time is valuable and want to thank you for joining us today for another hallway conversation. So whether it is this day, this week, this month, we hope the Lord gives you what you stand in need of. And as you go into this day, we want to offer you this blessing. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. The rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good day.
This podcast was quite literally dreamed up during one of our actual hallway conversations. Our music is by Ethan Mulder. Hallway Conversations is an independent podcast created and produced by Matt Beamers, Abby DeGroat, and Dave Mulder. Thanks for listening.